Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Mon, and feel free to grab some more coffee while we are reassembling. Good morning, everyone. I am looking forward to a deep dive in this panel into the impacts on Washington State, on our companies and different sectors of the tariff-happy world in which we are living in right now. Mon asked me to start this panel off. We had a conversation early last week with a quick overview of the current state of U.S.-China tariffs. And I thought, what could go wrong? Quite a few things, as it turned out. To go back a bit, just to fill in and put in context our current situation, if you go back to the pre-2017 world, sorry? A little closer? Go back to the 2017 world in which WTO rules were still largely operating. U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports were about 2.7% on average. Chinese tariffs on U.S. exports, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8%. By the end of the first Trump administration, those tariffs had risen to about 19% on Chinese imports to the United States, 21% on U.S. exports. But there were a lot of exceptions. Only about 60% of products were covered. The new iPhone I bought last year wasn't affected. Then, as you all know, on Liberation Day in April, President Trump announced an additional 34% tariff on China on top of what had been there previously. China hit back with its own tariffs. You may remember the market started to crash. President Trump said we're going to raise the tariffs to 145%. The Chinese responded in kind, and the chaos was sufficient that the two sides sat down and had a moderately serious negotiation and agreed to knock those back to roughly 10% additional tariffs. And that status quo has kind of more or less held since the spring. But if you throw in all the different sectoral tariffs, I mean, we forget, the Section 232 investigations. There have been a series of sectoral tariffs on steel and aluminum and others. Chad Bown at the Peterson Institute estimates the current U.S. tariff on Chinese imports is about 57% on average, with China's tariff on our exports at about 33%. And more products are included now, including a tariff on iPhones. So that was kind of where it stood when Mana and I talked early last week. And then the Chinese took new actions to restrict sales of rare earth exports, which I think will be talked about on the next panel. President Trump, as you all know, responded with his threat to impose 100% tariffs on November 1st. Who knows where that's going to go? There will likely be negotiations between now and when the two presidents are theoretically supposed to meet at the APEC summit in South Korea. So now that we are all more confused than ever, and welcome to this year, I'm going to turn to the industry and sector experts for some more specifics on how their businesses here in Washington State have been affected by the tariff uncertainty and how they are trying to respond. So just start with a kind of broad overview, fairly quick question, I hope, but from each of you from your unique perspectives. Where does the current moment fit in terms of challenges? One of the hardest? Is it easy? Somewhere in the middle? So Riley, why don't we start with you from the perspective of horticulture and fruits and vegetables here in Washington State? Where does this current moment fit?
Sure. Thanks, Ted. Am I close enough to the mic here? I think so. Looks like I'm getting some nods out there. Just real short. So we represent apple, cherry, and pear growers, and we export roughly 30% of the crop out of the Northwest every year. To answer your question, though, Ted, I think it's hard to hit a moving target. Depending on where you are this year, the answer would be different. Ahead of Liberation Day, I'm still trying to figure out from what we're being liberated. There's a lot of consternation, and then it kind of settled into, okay, we know what the playing field is for cherry season. Now we're coming back out of that. We're looking at the timelines for losing both the Section 301 exclusion process that we benefit from in China, and also potentially a return of those reciprocal tariff rates, and kind of concern comes back up again. But if you take a step back, I mean, we've faced in our industry retaliation going back to 2018. So our growers have lost roughly $900 million in export sales into China over that period of time. So there's kind of the mix of, okay, we've got all of this new kind of churn going on here, but we're also kind of still where we were, albeit at a higher 20% higher level this year. And so anyway, I think it's kind of a mix in the moment between, oh geez, what's going to happen, to, okay, at least we know it's not great, but here's where we're at.
Thanks, Ross. So kind of a decade of turmoil, really, in a lot of different ways. John, over to you on the aircraft side.
Well, since I left Boeing, I retired at the end of last year, so I've had about 9 months to kind of reflect back on a career, most of which almost 40 years of dealing with China. One thing you have to understand about commercial aviation industry is a very long cycle business, right? When you order airplanes, they're not delivered next week. They're often delivered years in advance. If you want to order an airplane today, it's probably in the early 2030s that you're going to get the delivery. So we have to think in very long time horizons. And, I saw, all the ups and downs in the, Jim and I sat in Beijing and over lots of beers and talked about these things many times. Hiccups in the relationship. We had the EP3 thing with Hainan. We had the embassy bombing in Yugoslavia. And every time we had one of those, could be arms sales to Taiwan, there would be, a chill. It felt like kind of being in the doghouse for a while, but it was always with the understanding that, it would end and we would get back to doing business. And it had the net effect of it was usually just slowing things down. We couldn't get a deal done that we wanted to get done. We had to wait 6 months or maybe a year. And it goes back to my favorite saying about China, what does PRC stand for? The P stands for patience, for a reason. So, here we are in another situation with a lot of uncertainty. And certainly, maybe a little worse, could have more impact. But I think the partners that Boeing has in China and the deep roots that the company over 53 years of doing business has set into that market, the relationships extend into the airlines, to the aviation regulator, to the air traffic control people, and all over the place. All the training that Boeing has done, the relationships are very deep and they continue to be strong. And we've always taken a long-term view that, and you have to in that industry. I mean, President Xi at some point won't be there anymore. President Trump at some point won't be there anymore. There are going to be different leaders in the future, but this partnership is for the long term. It's for the airplanes that we're going to deliver in, 7, 8, 10, 15 years from now. And so I still remain optimistic because, I witnessed firsthand the strength and the power of those relationships that were built over decades, that the business will continue to be successful there. And remember, Boeing, the commercial airplanes is one of the few industries where China doesn't yet have a viable domestic substitute. Yes, they're building airplanes. They're coming along. They will get there eventually. But to build up the scale to produce airplanes at the kind of production rates that they need, even just to supply the domestic market, much less export airplanes, they're still probably a decade or two away from that. So they need to import airplanes from Boeing. They need to import airplanes from Boeing's competitor, Airbus, for the foreseeable future. And so there needs to be a way to figure out how to make that happen.
Thanks very much, John. Kristen, this has been a wild year, I imagine, for the ports of Tacoma and Seattle. So over to you.
Yes. Hi, I'm Commissioner Kristen Eng, Managing Member of the Northwest Seaport Alliance, which is the ports of Tacoma and Seattle combined for maritime cargo. We handle about 4 million containers annually and support about 58,000 jobs across our region. And roughly 90% of our trade is with Asia, and China being our largest partner. 40% of our cargo by volume is with China, as well as 29% by value. This is a time of transformation and uncertainty, and I would say this is one of the hardest environments I've seen, although I'm fairly new, Commissioner, not because of congestion, because of the uncertainty. As of August 2025, the China share of our trade has dropped below pandemic levels, the lowest since 2009. And meanwhile, Vietnam at the same period has grown from 2% to 11% today as we seek emerging markets to fill that gap, but it is not enough. Even if you combine the next 5 Asian countries, it does not equal the trade with China. Before the trade tensions of 2018, or the tariffs, about 23% of our exports went to China. That's 16.5% today. On the import side, the share from China has fallen from 64% to 54%, or maybe actually under 50% this year, which we've never had that happen. So this is quite devastating for us at the ports. And you know what this really means behind those numbers. For example, a hay exporter has canceled every order to China, 15% of their business, and warns that prolonged tariffs could wipe out several companies. A pulp and paper shipper is rerouting through Canada and the EU. Food ingredient suppliers are shifting manufacturing to the US and other countries to avoid duties. And as you know, with the soybean farmers, I have seen them crying on TikTok and YouTube, all the things because China is not buying from the US through these retaliatory tariffs. Decoupling goes both ways. And it seems like this game of chicken where two cars are heading towards each other will have enormous impact when there's actually two lanes to the future. I think the United States does have to be mindful of its actions because when it moves, it can make the earth quake. However, the economic tsunami hits our ports, the American people, and the rest of the world and China. And the same thing with China. And so this is what we're currently facing. I mean, Governor Ferguson also just put out something in September, Office of Financial Management analysis of the tariffs effect on Washington State, approximately 32,000 fewer jobs by 2029. I'd expect that to actually increase with the way we're going, and particularly agricultural, food processing, and aerospace. Grocery prices rising 16%, used car prices also 20-25% over the couple next years. New cars, we've seen a decrease in our auto imports. We are actually a top 5 auto importer in the port of Tacoma these past few years with the rise of Korea. We also will see a state revenue decline because of tariff impacts and because of the slowing economy to $2.2 billion in state revenue in the next 4 years. So we are seeing slower economic growth in Washington State.
Christine, can you actually fill in one other thing for us here? We're mostly going to talk in this panel about tariffs. But I remember, I think we were together at a Witchett meeting maybe 18 months ago when Everett Eisenstadt, who'd worked in the first Trump administration, said, you know, you all should be paying attention to this Section 301 investigation of shipbuilding, because one of the remedies that's being suggested is port fees on Chinese ships calling. And that is coming to fruition, right? I mean, we are seeing the impact of that just starting to kick in. Do you want to fill that in a little bit? Because it's not a tariff per se, but potentially significant effect on the ports and on trade.
Yes, that would lead to cargo diversion, because if you do most of the ship.
Sorry, can you just give us a quick overview of what the level of it is? I'm still not quite clear how big a fee it is. Yeah.
Well, I think that changes. I'm going to have to defer that because it keeps on changing and people keep on negotiating and people keep on speaking with the administration, and they have listened. They have reduced. Believe me, our own government affairs and myself have gone to DC. Probably I've been to DC the most this year than any other year to talk about the harbor maintenance tax, which would make our trade fair with Canada, as well as these shipping fees on Chinese-made ships, along with the cranes. Most of our ships and cranes are made by China because they can make them very well. They build very well and very fast and efficient, and that has benefited us. But to put those particular charges on those ships when they land in would lead to cargo diversion. They'd simply just go to Canada or Mexico and then truck it up here or put it on trains or rail, and that would avoid our ports for some of them. Some other shipping lines like CMA CGM said they'll simply reroute their ships that are not made in China to service our US gateways. But that's very difficult for others to do. And so in a way, it would make our West Coast ports less competitive. Overall ports, but we are also taking a look at, as I say with any type of policy, we'll navigate it and see how we can also take advantage of this particular situation. So we do want to build a shipbuilding industry in Washington State. We should be building the ferries here. We should be building at the Port of Tacoma. We used to have a Navy dock right at our early business center, EBC, and we need few $100 million to rebuild that. And if you want shipbuilding here, I think the one thing that they forgot is that in order to have manufacturing and infrastructure, you have to invest first in the United States into our infrastructure. You can't throw a punch and not actually have a counter.
Excellent comment. Thanks, Kristen. Julia, over to you. And you and I were having a really interesting conversation at dinner last evening. So just explain a little bit about how your business operates and then talk a little bit about the tariff impacts.
My name is Julia Ying. I'm in the seafood business. Actually, basically, we are a small business buying fish from Alaska and ship it over to Asia and right now also Latin America for processing. And part of the finished products comes back to the United States. And people might not really know, 20 years ago, 90% of the fish products that people consume in the United States were produced in China. And China used to be the biggest processing hub in the whole world of processing wild fish. And nowadays it is 70%. Talking about the how challenging right now comparing with any of the historical period of our small industry as seafood fish processing. Actually, I feel like it is not the most challenging period of time for us. Well, the most challenging period of time is the pandemic, when that imported fish to China was said brought the virus. And then that kind of restriction to our fish raw material in the boundary cold storage, if the package was found any virus of COVID, then the raw material should be, the lockdown of the cold storage could be over 2 years, 3 years until the raw material expire. So during that period of time, actually, every day we open our eyes and we hope there is some hope that we could still get the fish out for processing. And the market got severe shortage, and that's caused a supply chain issue during that period of time, especially our species. And the ocean freight gone up to 10 times comparing with the normal time. So which means shipping a container load from China to Seattle used to be $1,500 US for 40-foot high refrigerated container. But that price could gone up to $20,000 US during the pandemic. So actually the worst time taught this industry how to survive. So from that time on, with the Alaskan part and also sponsored by the government, we started to do the searching for the secondary processing hub outside China. So nowadays, 70% of Alaskan fish produced still in China, but 30% outside China. We're doing in Southeast Asia, we're doing in Latin America, we're doing the training, and the problem is not totally solved. But nowadays, with the tariff, it is of a lot of uncertainty. But again, it is not desperate. Still, if it is just a tariff, it is okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So money is something comparing with survival. It is something less important. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Julia. Julia started to actually get into the next question I wanted to ask, which is about how each of your businesses is trying to respond to uncertainty. I just want to flag what I think is a very good piece in the current issue of Foreign Affairs by Adam Posen, where he describes the United States as having played kind of the role of a big insurance company for the world for a long time, that other countries paid us in different ways, but we provided a kind of stability in terms of the rules of the trading system, shipping lanes, some level of currency stability, and others. We are now in an era clearly of heightened instability. And maybe I'll start again with you, Riley, because you say your industry's been living in this for a good chunk of the last decade. What are the strategies for adapting? Are there good strategies? I mean, I'll come back to Julia. I think part of what she was saying is this, there are strategies, but they're not great ones. So how has each of your sectors been trying to adapt to the growing uncertainty that we've seen as a result of the tariffs and other measures?
Yeah, I think you know, we ship apples to 60 countries around the world. We ship cherries to a little over 40. Pears about somewhere in between. So the natural answer obviously is to kind of double down on that diversification and look for other opportunities. You know, I think the challenge is obviously you have a very significant population in China that's hard to ignore. And so even though we have all this pressure, China last cherry season was still the #2 export market for cherries. That dropped to 4 this year for a few different reasons, but a 20% additional tariff is chief among them. So I think that's really where we've focused, and from a kind of policy perspective, everything that's going on and the kind of trend line in DC as it relates to China has so many intertwined issues that are so far above and beyond fruit. That's kind of playing out at this level. And if we're kind of stuck in that mix, our effort and push has been, okay, then we need help in these other markets where we have SPS issues or we have tariff barrier issues. Because I mean, it's hard to argue with the fact that we do face a number of unfair trade barriers around the world that limit our access into good markets that could help offset some of these losses into China. So that's kind of where we've been focused from a policy perspective, but also obviously an economic perspective. If you just look at the shift in where exports are going in Asia, you know, Vietnam's up. Korea for cherries and Japan for cherries are up over the last few years. You know, we're also doubling down in Mexico and Canada. So, you know, knock on wood about USMCA discussions, but obviously there's a natural reason to do that given where we're located. But that's kind of been the economic shift as well, dealing with this reality while still obviously playing a fairly important role, or China playing a fairly important role in our export kind of basket.
Can I push you a little bit, Riley, just on the other side of this?
Professor would.
No, so you mentioned the Section 301 exclusion process. There used to be a way to try to plead for exclusions from certain tariffs. This administration has flipped it, and it's actually got an inclusion process, basically saying, you know, should we add tariffs in other areas? Has your industry considered saying, well, maybe we need to protect our domestic market more? Maybe we need to keep Canadian apples and cherries out. They don't sell a lot down here, but have you looked in the other direction too to say, well, okay, we're losing international markets. Maybe we need to do more to protect our home market. I mean, that's a classic dynamic in trade wars where you see countries turning inward because there aren't great options.
Yeah, no, not at this point. We haven't quite got to that point of import sensitivity, with the exception of one processed product, canned pears, where the U.S. is basically the only market for canned pears, but that's got a longer history than this. So, and just for clarity, the exclusion process is actually the one over in China that importers have the ability to get. That it hasn't been talked about a whole lot publicly, but China has taken a couple runs at withdrawing that, not really saying anything, but just posting on the online system that importers use, hey, by the way, this is going to be going away. And they did that once this summer, and then that kind of got wrapped up into those discussions and all the other tariff extensions. So I think the deadline for this is October 30th, was when they kind of last said it was going to pop back up again. So, you know, we kind of, again, that gets back to your first question. You're in this kind of churn of uncertainty. So somewhat we'll see here in a couple weeks what pops back up on that.
John, has Boeing had to adapt, or does the longer time frame that you were talking about earlier give the company a little more protection in the current moment, a little more protection from the cycles?
Well, one interesting, unique aspect of commercial aviation is there's something called the WTO Agreement on Trade and Civil Aircraft that was signed by 33 countries back around 1980. And this basically eliminated all duties on civil aircraft, engines, parts, flight simulators, and some other things. And this has largely held during this period, and so it's led to, you know, tremendous reciprocity in the industry, and it's enabled the growth of a sector, a manufacturing sector here in the U.S. that's been just astronomical. I think I've read some figure that the aerospace industry has grown by like 2,200%, since that agreement was signed, and it's one of the largest contributors to our trade surplus in the manufacturing sector. It definitely makes an impact, and it sustains a lot of jobs. It's not just Boeing, it's all the multitude of, there's probably 100,000 suppliers to the industry throughout the United States and just about every state that the industry supports. So that agreement has held. Now, and China, by the way, both US and China are part of the 33 signatories to that. If something changes there and we start messing with that, I think that's going to be very bad for the industry. If suddenly, for example, aircraft parts are subject to duties moving around the globe, and they're sourced all over the place. I mean, they could be coming from anywhere because manufacturers, it's a very globalized industry. The supply chain is tremendously globalized. If parts get more expensive, I think you would find airlines are going to struggle, and they're going to look for secondhand parts, or maybe even in some countries, black market parts. And you don't want that. Because that starts to affect safety. And that was one of the motivators behind this agreement, is to enable, a very safe global aviation system. And so I think there's good arguments to not mess with it. Certainly there's a great jobs argument here in the US. It's definitely an industry that the government should be supporting. And I think the industry, the Aerospace Industries Association, has put out a white paper if you're interested in reading more about this. But the impact of the industry is huge. And there's really strong arguments, I think, not to mess with it. Now, is the industry immune to tariffs? No. Certainly raw materials don't fall under that agreement. And so, as manufacturers look for the inputs like aluminum and steel and titanium and other things, there's definitely impacts there. I know the supply chain organization at Boeing is out, always looking at how to diversify that supply chain to try to mitigate those risks. But, there's definitely risk. And there's an ongoing Section 232 investigation on civil aircraft that gets back to the Venn diagram on national security. How much does import of aerospace goods impact national security? I guess we'll find out fairly soon what the result of that is. So there's another question mark that's hanging over the industry. But man, I mean, this is a hugely important industry to the United States, and it's one of those that's one of the few that has that surplus, and I think we'd want to work hard to maintain that.
John, do you have any sense of what might be coming down in that 232? There's so many different investigations that they're hard to keep track of, quite honestly. But so far, in every single case, the president has announced tariffs of some sort. Under that investigation, I mean, what are the possible targets for tariffs if the administration concludes, as seems likely, since they've done it for upholstered furniture? It seems likely they can find a national security risk in civil aircraft. What might happen under that?
Yeah, I mean,
kind of crystal ball?
That is the typical outcome, right? It always is tariffs. You don't start the investigation, and it's usually what they're trying to get at. But it'd be kind of odd, given how robust the industry is. What could you do? Well, you could put tariffs on Airbus airplanes coming into the U.S., for example. But the airlines aren't going to like that. They want to have access to the manufacturing capability of both Boeing and Airbus. It's a duopoly. These are the two big manufacturers. And so I imagine the airlines are going to scream about that, because any kind of a tariff on an airplane, the airlines, it's still a very thin margin business. The asset, the cost of ownership of the assets of airplanes is a big component of their cost equation. And even just a few % increase in that impacts their bottom line directly. It is really very, very sensitive to that. So I can't imagine how that's going to work. I mean, I think what will happen is they'll end up rejecting deliveries if there's a big tariff on them, like an Airbus airplane coming into the United States. They'll just sort of wait and try to work through it and see if they can get the exemptions that would be needed. But I think there's going to be strong arguments from all different corners of the industry to argue for exemption.
Thanks very much. Kristen, you mentioned a couple of what seem to me like adaptations already. One is the idea of taking advantage of what's happening on shipbuilding. The other, as you said, you've been spending a lot of time talking to people in Washington to try to mitigate the worst impacts. Walk us through some of the different things that the ports have been doing to try to deal with the current level of uncertainty.
So the trade tensions has been happening since 2017, 2018, at least a lot of the changes there. So we have been diversifying without decoupling, increasing our attention to countries like Vietnam, although that is actually highly associated with China, Thailand, Malaysia, even India. But like I said, not decoupling, because China still is our #1 trading partner, despite the fact trade with China has actually decreased by 40% in our gateway since 2018. I think both by volume and by value. We still invest in infrastructure resilience, investing in on-dock rail in our terminals and our deepening, because we still believe, there is a future for ports and trade. With this administration, if they're willing to make bold strokes and investments and really truthfully believe in that, then yes, invest in shipbuilding, invest in American ports, do away with the harbor maintenance tax or reduce it so that we are competitive with Canada. Because every time a ship comes into Seattle or Tacoma, there is this harbor maintenance tax that doesn't happen when they go to Canada and then simply truck or rail down to the same markets that we're going to. So if you really want to make America great again, invest in it. Invest in its infrastructure, invest in its people. I would also say, in terms of processing, there was a leaked business article, but there are people looking at fish processing at the port of Tacoma. So instead of Alaska or Northwest fish going to China, to come back to us, they would simply be processed here. But like I said, we should actually have better relationships with China, more respectful. And in a way, we are trying to build relationships all across Asia, whether that's with our Korean partners, in which we somewhat apologize with what happened in Georgia, because they were investing in there faithfully, as well as giving technology and billions of dollars. And we think they're great partners. We think China is a great partner. So when we do meet with them, it is like we're meeting friends. This world can have two powerful economies, and it has to work for the American people, the Chinese people, and the rest of the world, because what we do has been impacting everyone else. And so that is how we manage risk, is we simply keep on investing in infrastructure. We have to make it resilient, efficient. That's still the basics. At the same time, we have been increasing our relationship building on our own, but also encouraging that in DC, more collaboration and connection like we did during the pandemic. With truckers, with shippers, everyone else, and even our advocacy has increased. A lot of the times there's this tension between labor and trade agreements, those who want trade, international trade, but that is shifting. The ILW, that is the dock workers, they put out a statement, at least our local one, ILW 23, that said, they strongly oppose the escalation and continued use of tariff threats by both Chinese and United States governments. Trade policies based on chaotic and unpredictable tariffs have led to unnecessary inflation and financial uncertainty in our communities, at our job sites, and at the dinner tables of working class families in America. And I think this is what it's going to have to do, is an education and humanization, as someone said out there, of the world about each other. Because I think as a country, we are learning about how trade has benefited us and how trade can impact us, but also about immigrant labor. I think that's another thing that people didn't realize, was how much immigrants contributed to our economy, into our taxes, and how much we're reliant on the labor force. And so I think it's a learning experience, and it is a time of transformation, and those with vision and will can make changes.
And Kristen, just quickly, you suggested earlier that there has been some responsiveness in Washington to your concerns, particularly over the new port tax. Are there people to talk to in this administration who are willing to listen to concerns? Because I think across a lot of sectors, the feeling has been no, that they've got their agenda. but have you had some sense that there's a willingness to modify these actions based on some knowledge about impact? Logan, anybody else on the panel who wants to take
I
that?
don't want to call it taco. I say it's more like mitigation. When I get asked by actually people from different parts of the world, like, well, I can advise, it's up to the administration to listen. And sometimes they do listen and they will reduce, mitigate their initial policies. Sometimes it is very bold and out there and it's a lot of fees. And then they'll start reducing and realizing the effects. And they're like, well, maybe we can change this, but you just have to go along. Like, we're going to do it, but maybe we'll do less of it. But what I do hear from DC is that you're right. People from the chambers of commerce to other trade experts, this is like, I can't believe we are on the same boat in a way that they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what's going on. I was like, do I have more information than you do? And so it is a very interesting time. I've even suggested to people to go on Truth Social and other social medias to influence trade policy. But I do think, somebody talked about Congress going to China. I think Congress and Americans should travel and should go to China and other places and develop relationships.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was asked to do a briefing a while ago for a Japanese company to explain the U.S. trade policy process, and I thought back to how trade policy used to get made through these lower level committees in the government, and ideas would work their way up, and the toughest stuff would go to the top. And I was thinking through, how's trade policy made now? Well, Trump announces it on Truth Social, and then everybody in the administration scrambles to figure out how to implement it.
Well, look how many years about de minimis. We talked about de minimis. I've been going to D.C. about de minimis, and then President Trump simply said, taking that out, done. Like, we've been advocating, probably DHS and other people have been advocating differently, but we've been advocating about de minimis, and President Trump simply said, I don't like it, bye. I was like, oh, well, maybe I can talk to him about the harbor maintenance tax. And I've talked to labor and others like, hey, this guy's willing to sign off on a couple things. There are some things that we could do. We do have to be more strategic and careful. And maybe we need to be bold and for the American people to understand, and other things where we could lessen the rhetoric. I think that's also what I get asked by shippers and other people around the world, like, what's up with, American politicians' rhetoric with China? Even in Taiwan, like, we just want to do business and have a peaceful life. And I was like, don't worry, we'll still do that. But it's gotten to the point where the rhetoric and the emotions and insecurity has taken over the policy. And that is not beneficial for anyone.
Julia, speaking of doing business and having a peaceful life, you mentioned a couple of ways in which you've tried to adapt to the challenges with China, moving some processing to Southeast Asia. Are there limitations to that? How much flexibility do you have in terms of reordering your supply chains to deal with the current uncertainties?
Well, we have been doing this global processing for 3 years. Throughout this practice of the 3 years, we clearly noticed and realized that there is no any other processing hub could totally replace China. So, working ethic-wise, efficiency-wise, skillness-wise, nowhere could compare with China. Our industry have been built up for 30 years. So people working diligently, they are so skillful, and they could solve any problem in a short period of time. But we totally lost this capability when we are doing the global processing in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. So I have never been so appreciated to the supply from China ever. But after the 3 years of practice, I realized so. And again, efficiency-wise and population-wise, labor force-wise, put all of the potential reprocessing hub together. It cannot replace China in the volume for the United States market. So that is so far what I have seen. I don't know. Maybe in 5 years, when AI technology combined with engineering technology, the machine will totally replace the labor force of human being, then that could be achievable. But actually, our industry should get prepared for that. We should start to do something, working together with the technology part to help to have this part of prime processing back to the United States. I guess that's the only hope.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to throw this out to whoever wants to take it. And I think Sean teed it up reasonably well in his comments about the need perhaps for state level delegations to China. I'm trying to think about, in the current environment, how a state like Washington distinguishes itself from what's going on nationally. It has nothing to do with trade policy, but I was quite struck by the formation of the West Coast Health Alliance, in which you had some of the Western states come together and say, we don't like what's coming out of the federal government on vaccine recommendations. We want to make sure our citizens get vaccinated. We're going to develop our own procedures and go forward in that area. Now, health policy, obviously, states have a lot more control than they do in trade policy, but are there things that Washington State or Washington in conjunction with other like-minded states should be doing to try to send a different message to China and to other places on trade? Is there a way at the state level to say, actually, we want to stay much more engaged in trade? We don't support some of the things that are coming out of Washington, D.C. Part of the hope, I think, in this conference is to develop ideas for action. So I want to throw it over to any of you who wants to weigh in. Are there things we can do to distinguish ourselves as a state in the trade space?
Sure.
I'm going to stump you all. Kristen, thank you.
Okay. So last month, Seaport Alliance and myself had a meeting with Governor Ferguson to talk about a Washington State trade strategy. This has not been done before, and I think there does need to be importance put on trade, and it does need leadership by the top in Washington State as well as commerce, whether that is attracting more companies here, investments, or like what we did in the pandemic, more coordination and connection between our state government and support for trade, as well as trade missions, as well as building the relationships, welcoming the Vietnam delegation like we did to the state legislature, and even a trip to China. I think there needs to be both ways, both to outside sending a message. I said, we need to send a message, Governor. We'd like you to attend our State of Trade event, which is coming up at the end of October. And we also need to send a message to our people about the benefits of trade and about relationship building with other people in the world. And how it can benefit them. Because right now, Americans are aggrieved and angry about what's going on in the United States. There's an affordability issue, there's a healthcare issue, and it's easy to point a finger at everybody else outside. So if we want changes, we'll have to deal with that as well if we want better trade. I think, and trade does have to be better if we want our labor partners on board, our environmental partners. And I tell them we do have to engage and reach out and connect to have this understanding, because you can make trade and other people a monster, but then these policies will work against them. And it actually will work against all the values and goals that they actually have in mind, whether labor, environment, and others, or American workers simply wanting to have a house and be able to raise a family. So I do think our strategy does have to change. We have to be more engaged. We have to communicate to our public as well as people around the world that we want stability. I don't think only China wants stability. I think businesses in the United States, when I hear from them, when they're crying out to me, they want stability because either they want to be in business to be able to put bread on the table, or they simply want to invest and don't know where to invest. So we do have to be, although those who are agile are able to do it, but we do have to be more connected and collaborate. And I do mean not just in our state, but with other countries.
I'll second that. I think there's lots of nice nonstop flights from SeaTac Airport here to China, most of them on Boeing 787s. Get on a plane, go there, foster the relationships between the state of Washington and China. Go there and learn. And I think, as Sean pointed out, they're ready to roll out the red carpet, eager for those kind of exchanges. I would add to that, also support the programs at the universities for study of China. We got to get more students getting on those airplanes and going over there for a semester abroad or a 3-week summer program or whatever it is. That all dried up during COVID. It's come back a little bit, but not nearly to the scale that existed prior to COVID. And I think UW, Washington State, all have programs focused on China. Support those, and let's get more youth exchanges, because that's the future, people to people.
John, you're retired now, so I can throw this at you. Do you think Boeing's willing to be proactive on some of this stuff? I mean, the company's faced so many challenges that I wonder whether it wants to keep its head down a bit, or do you think on this set of issues, Boeing might be willing to be out front?
Well, it's hard because it's such a big company, right? And it has a defense business as well. I would just say it's an art and how to navigate all that in Washington. We have a very strong government affairs team there that does that. But we certainly aren't shy about talking about the importance of China to Boeing. I mean, if you look at the 20-year forecast that we put out every year on the commercial market for commercial airplanes, China is the single largest market. It is 20% of the global demand. It's 9,000 airplanes over the next 20 years that China needs to have to maintain even just a modest growth. I think our forecast for the growth is, what, Hank, like 4% or something like that. It's not even what it used to be, but that's a lot of airplanes. Consider that, just to put that in perspective, over the last 53 years, Boeing delivered about 1,800 airplanes to China. There's 9,000 needed over the next 20 years. It's a massive market, and it sustains so many good quality jobs here. It's too important, and we're not shy about talking about that everywhere. Sometimes it has to be a little more private, right? Not out in public, but yes, absolutely.
Riley or Julia, do you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we step back out of tree fruit for a second and look at the broader kind of underlying sentiments around China and trade generally, I fully agree that, just more interaction in a broader space is needed somewhere along the line. I think we'd all agree we've lost some of the trade narrative, and the only way you're going to get that back is by having people talk to each other and realize it's not an us-them thing. It's an all of us here. I mean, we're a unique crowd here today. We're all out talking about this stuff where we like the wonky part of this world. But, the average person out there kind of looks at this and goes, well, geez, free trade kills jobs is a really simple slogan. And if we all have to bring out a bunch of charts and explain why it's important, let's just show people, get those interactions going, get that opportunity. To kind of drill down a little bit in terms of, to us though, I think, because I don't think you can necessarily fix the issues we have that way beyond kind of a top level discussion for tree fruit, because it's all tariff related and it's so much broader geopolitically, et cetera. But where I think there is opportunity more locally for us is how can we improve access or other things outside of the trade policy space to other markets. And Commissioner Ng, and I saw Steve Blasky running around somewhere back there, but they're working all the time to try and increase lines of service out of SeaTac. And if we can't get our product out of the state, and if we have to pay to truck it elsewhere in the country, we don't have the option because of phytosanitary rules to go up through Canada. You start talking about diversions and losing service. We've seen how that works through COVID, some of which we haven't got those back. There's Latin America. There's a lot of places that we could sell a lot of fruit, provided we have access. And so thank you for trying to work on that. But I think it's those types of things where we can look in a narrow strategic fashion, kind of below this broader fray, to actually move commerce in the state. And we're not the only ones that rely on that export backhaul, essentially, for our product. So I think there are opportunities there as well.
Excellent. A great set of ideas. I want to open it up now to questions. I imagine there are others in this room whose sectors, businesses have also been affected by the tariffs and the trade actions. So questions for our panelists. Let's go right here, and then we'll go to Jim. Yeah. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you. And identify yourself.
Oh, yeah, this is Xiaobin from DL Paper. Yeah, I'm mainly serving the international clients doing business in the US. So regarding this, because due to the US-China tension and the tariff, so what's your advice for Chinese companies doing business serving our market in US? And can they or should they set up the kind of a new business in US and all investment from US, that way would be part of our economy, give us more job opportunity, help us grow our business here. Thank you.
This is a great question. I think most of this panel is more outward looking in terms of our export opportunities, but this is definitely part of the broader conversation. It was brought up on the last panel. What's the advice to Chinese companies wanting to come here? Do you want to give it a shot, Kristen? You're smiling like you.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is not on my port hat or Northwest Seaport Alliance hat. I would suggest get a really good lobbyist. Because that works in DC and hence why companies headquarter there. But lobbying works. As an advocate, I also advocate on the state. Lobbying and advocacy at this administration and their people who run things and agencies have worked, and people have been able to get exemptions and other things. So that is my more practical advice. But also, talk to other people. We'll build relationships. But my emphasis on a personal level is government affairs.
I think this is a really interesting conversation going forward. And again, Sean alluded to it in his keynote remarks. I'm old enough to have remembered the US-Japan trade conflicts. And a lot of what eventually sort of smoothed that over was Japanese companies investing in the United States, building big auto plants. And so suddenly there seemed to be benefits to American workers. There were other things that made a difference as well. For a variety of reasons, that's been harder with China because of the security concerns. I mean, Jim has the next question, so maybe he could respond to this in a way. But I think potentially that is a way where over time some of the tensions get diminished because you see Americans benefiting from Chinese investment, but there are a lot of roadblocks between here and there. So Jim, you had your hand up. Why don't I give you the next question? And if you want to respond to that at all, please go ahead. Do you want to wait for the mic? It's right here. Right here in the front, Jim McGregor.
Yeah, I want to ask John about COMAC. The airline manufacturing in America is the last real bastion of manufacturing. There's a lot of manufacturing, but you guys are so important. COMAC's now come out with this is the Chinese airline maker, come out with a 919. Is that selling? Is there a point where you're worried about COMAC becoming a peer competitor around the world?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. The answer, it's a little complicated. They absolutely have the capability to get into this industry. It's been a duopoly for a long time. It's Boeing and Airbus, lots of books written about that, and we talked about that earlier. But when you look at the total global market, that forecast that I referred to earlier, the total market is 40,000 airplanes for the globe over that 20-year period. And I would argue that even if you look at the most optimistic production rate forecasts for both Boeing and Airbus, they're not going to be able to fill all of that demand. It's time and there's room for other competitors to come into this business. It makes sense that it's China because they have the largest domestic market to sustain it. And they have that technological capability that you talked about in your remarks. And so they're going to get there. The hard part of this industry is scaling it up. They're a very young company. They're still learning. They are producing airplanes, but at a very low production rate today. And scaling that up, especially considering that they're dependent on the same global supply chain that both Boeing and Airbus depend on, which is struggling today. I mean, it's a very supply-constrained industry today, and it's going to continue to be that way for quite a while, I think into the next decade even. So they're going to struggle with managing that global supply chain, getting that production rate up. But eventually they'll start to take, a growing share of that domestic China market. But them getting to the point where they're a peer competitor I think we're some decades away from that, where they're going to be able to be competitive globally, being able to provide, engineering and fleet support to airlines around the world on a 24/7 basis. It's a hard learning curve, and even Boeing has had its stumbles in the past few years, and Boeing's a 100-plus-year-old company. So and I know the COMAC people, and they kind of chuckle, what are you worried about? We've got such a long way to go. But we're not naive. We know the Chinese are capable, and they're going to get there eventually. But there's room. There's room for that competition. I think Boeing, I think looks forward to that competition, and maybe it'll make Boeing better. The fact that somebody's coming up on our heels, Boeing's going to have to go invest in more R&D and try to stay ahead. So it's not a bad thing necessarily.
We'll do one last quick question. I was going to end that on an optimistic note, but I'll take one last quick question. Jake here, and then we need to move on to the next panel.
Thank you to everyone on the panel. I want to sort of follow up on that, the issue of hiring lobbyists and trying to change the direction the policymakers are going, applying pressure. There's one side of this which is kind of privately speaking behind closed doors. This is really going to hurt my business. I need you to change the regulations, otherwise it's going to have really counterproductive effects. I think that's been going on quite a bit. Then there's another side of this, which is asserting in public the direction that we're going in the U.S.-China relationship is leading us into very negative outcomes for our country, for China, for the world. And this is sort of about making a bigger framing argument for where the relationship needs to go. And I think my impression is that businesses have been terrified of doing that kind of work or even supporting that kind of work. And as Commissioner Ong also mentioned, I think there was a point at which politicians felt like we're going to say this about China, but then when it comes to doing policy, we're going to be pragmatic. And I think it's now tipped over into the point where the rhetoric is starting to shape the policy in serious ways, and it's leading to very destructive policy outcomes. People felt like they could kind of ride the tiger, and now the tiger has taken off. And so the question is, what is your feeling for where the business community is on this issue? I'm a little bit, I guess, heartened by like Jensen Huang from NVIDIA is out there throwing some pretty sharp elbows on the China issue, not always in a responsible way, I think, but in a way that is sort of expressing some confidence that actually we have a good argument on this and we need to make it in public. We can't just do this behind closed doors. We need to change the overall rhetoric around this relationship. Otherwise, we're going to lose those. We're going to bit by bit lose the arguments behind closed doors too, or the landscape will just change under our feet. And what we thought we were looking out for with these discrete policy changes are just going to not be viable anymore. Is there kind of, are we turning the corner on, is business willing to make public arguments, willing to support those of us who are trying to make a different, like larger framing for the relationship? Or is the fear about standing up for a constructive U.S.-China relationship, is that still really powerful?
Thank you, Jake. I think we're going to need one fairly quick response because we're supposed to wrap it up. Anyone want to brave that one? Stefan, I knew you would, Kristen. Yeah.
Friends of the administration, big businesses, they will approach privately. However, there is one sector that is not so private and very direct, and those are the farmers. The farmers, because of retaliatory tariffs, they are the hit hardest. We are also a top agricultural port, #2 in refrigerated products. They are the ones making the statements out there. They are the ones on social media crying out, like, we voted for you. Help us change these policies. Because even if they got the bailout, it doesn't change the policy. They will continually need help. So they are making the case. There is now businesses pleading for a change in policy.
Okay, I think we had a couple of optimistic notes there on the health of the aerospace industry and the possibility for change. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks to our panelists for a great discussion. Really appreciate it.